knows that his lover has mysteriously left him, and we find him in great pain. But he doesn't yet know why.
At 65, the truth behind Colin Firth isn't just sad, it's devastating. For decades, he was the man audiences trusted with their hearts. The quiet force behind Mr. Darcy, the Oscar-winning king in The King's Speech, the embodiment of grace under pressure. On-screen, he mastered love, dignity, and restraint. But off-screen, life had a far crueler script waiting. Because behind the polished image of the perfect gentleman, everything was quietly falling apart. What looked like a fairy tale marriage began to fracture in ways no one saw coming. Trust turned into betrayal, privacy turned into headlines, and the man who built a legacy on emotional control found himself at the center of a storm that couldn't be contained, rewritten, or performed away. This isn't a story about fading fame or missed roles. It's about something far more brutal. What happens when the person you built your life around becomes the source of your deepest humiliation? When love doesn't just end, it turns against you. And the most heartbreaking part? He never broke character. Even as the scandal unfolded, even as the world watched, Colin Firth remained exactly who he had always been. Measured, composed, impossibly dignified. Not because he wasn't hurting, but because some people don't know how to be anything else. So what really happened behind the closed doors of one of cinema's most respected men? And how do you rebuild when the life you believed in was never what it seemed? To understand that, we have to go back, before the headlines, before the betrayal, back to where it all began, when it still looked like a love story worth believing in. He didn't arrive in Hollywood on a wave of luck or privilege. He arrived with silence, the kind that hides everything. Born in 1960 in Hampshire to deeply academic parents, his world was built on intellect, not emotion. His father lectured on history. His mother studied comparative religion. At their dinner table, ideas mattered more than feelings. Kant over confession, theology over vulnerability. And somewhere in that silence, a young boy learned to feel everything, but say nothing. Colin was sharp, observant, and quietly overwhelmed. The kind of child who absorbed emotion like a storm cloud but had no language to release it. So he found one, not in conversation, but in performance. Acting became his escape hatch, his translator, his only safe place to bleed without being seen. Drama school didn't roll out the red carpet. He wasn't the obvious star. Not the loudest, not the most dazzling. Rejection came often and stayed longer. Letters stacked up, doors closed, but something about him lingered. A stillness, a restraint. Casting directors began to notice what others missed. He didn't perform pain, he carried it. And that became his signature. By the time he stepped into the role that would change everything, he had already mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. Then came 1995, and with it, Pride and Prejudice. As Mr. Darcy, he didn't just act, he defined a generation's idea of restrained desire. That single unforgettable lake scene didn't just go viral before viral existed, it rewrote the rules of romantic masculinity. Overnight, Colin Firth became the man women dreamed about, and men quietly studied. He didn't chase fame, it locked on to him. The timing couldn't have been sharper. Britain was ready, hungry for a leading man who wasn't loud, flashy, or imported. Someone who carried quiet power, old-world charm with something deeper beneath it. And Colin delivered, effortlessly. Then came Bridget Jones's Diary, and suddenly he wasn't just admired, he was idealized. The patient man, the emotionally steady one, the kind who waits while you figure yourself out. The fantasy of emotional safety wrapped in a tailored suit. But here's the truth no one saw coming. That was the role, not the man. Because off-screen, the pattern had already taken hold. A man who gave more than he kept, who felt more than he showed, who had spent a lifetime mastering restraint even when it cost him everything. The night the world crowned him king, the irony was almost too sharp to ignore. At the Academy Awards in 2011, Colin Firth stood under the spotlight, clutching gold for The King's Speech, a story about a man learning to finally speak what he's been too afraid to say. The audience saw triumph. What they didn't see was the quiet contradiction. The man delivering that performance was still silencing parts of himself. From the outside, it looked like the summit. Prestige, respect, a career so polished it almost felt untouchable. But peaks have a cruel truth. Once you reach them, there's no illusion left, just gravity. And gravity was coming. Because behind the applause, another story had already begun. One softer, deeper, and far more dangerous. A love story that felt at first like refuge. He met Livia Giugioli in the early 1990s on a quiet BBC set in Italy. She wasn't part of the spotlight, just a production assistant with a presence you couldn't ignore. Effortless, magnetic, the kind of beauty that didn't ask for attention but owned it anyway. Next to her, British restraint felt almost rehearsed. Their connection didn't build, it sparked. Colin was measured, deliberate, a man who examined every step before taking it. Livia was the opposite, instinctive, alive, unpredictable, fire meeting ice. And somehow, instead of clashing, they fused. Friends would later say she disarmed him completely, something few had ever managed. For a man so carefully guarded, that kind of vulnerability felt equal parts intoxicating and terrifying. What pulled him in wasn't fame, it was her indifference to it. She saw past the rising star and locked on to something real. Art, purpose, change. She believed in things that couldn't be packaged or performed, and that authenticity hit him harder than any applause ever could. By 1997, they chose each other. No spectacle, no grand display. Just a quiet, deliberate commitment, almost like he was trying to protect this one part of his life from the world that kept taking everything else. Together, they built something that looked unshakable. 2 sons, a shared life, a love that from the outside felt grounded, enduring, even perfect. But the most fragile stories are often the ones that look the strongest, right before they break. The first crack in the story wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines. It didn't even look like a problem, at least not at first glance. Because before the vows, before the polished image of a perfect marriage, there was already a quiet complication written into their beginning. Luca wasn't Colin Firth's biological son. He was from Livia Giugioli's previous relationship, born before they ever said "I do." And without hesitation, Colin stepped in, adopted him, and raised him as his own. To the outside world, it looked like something noble, proof of character, a man capable of loving without conditions. But beneath that quiet gesture, something more complicated took root. Because from the very beginning, Colin wasn't just building a family. He was trying to earn his place in it. Always adjusting, always accommodating, always bending just enough to keep everything from falling apart. And over time, that kind of love stops being love at all. It becomes fear, dressed up as devotion. Their life stretched between London and the rolling hills of Umbria, where a sprawling countryside villa became Livia's vision brought to life. She poured herself into it, an eco-conscious sanctuary buzzing with environmental activists, sustainability workshops, and purpose. It was her world, her identity, her mission. And Colin, he made it all possible. He funded the dream, supported it without question, spoke about it with pride. The world saw a rare kind of partnership, a power couple with depth, raising their children far from Hollywood's noise, grounded in nature and meaning. The image was perfect. On red carpets, Colin often stood alone, offering a soft explanation. Livia preferred purpose over publicity. People admired that. They respected it. What they didn't see was the slow disappearance happening in plain sight. A man shrinking, piece by piece, making space for someone else's life, until there was barely anything left of his own. In every interview, Colin spoke about Livia like she was gravity itself, his anchor, his compass, the reason his world held together. It was poetic, almost too perfect. But beneath the elegance of his words, something was missing. He never spoke about how she made him feel, only what she meant. Not love as an experience, but love as an idea. And that's where the illusion lived. Because behind closed doors, the balance was different. Livia decided, Colin complied. Her voice shaped the direction of his career. What roles elevated him, what choices aligned with their values, what paths were simply not acceptable. And Colin? He adjusted, smiled, performed. He was, after all, a master of roles, including the role of a happy husband. Those closest to them saw it, the quiet pattern, the unspoken hierarchy. But from the outside, it looked like devotion, like respect, like love. What they didn't see was the quiet trade he had made. When someone rescues you from loneliness, he once implied, you learn to hold on, no matter the cost. To Colin, being needed felt like purpose, like salvation. But being needed is not the same as being valued. And when that truth finally surfaced, it didn't just crack the image, it shattered the entire story they had built. Because in 2018, the fairy tale didn't fade. It detonated. Italian headlines erupted overnight. Livia had filed stalking charges against journalist Marco Brancaccia, a man she had known since childhood. The accusations were explosive. Years of harassment, threatening messages, unwanted appearances. A nightmare, she claimed. Colin did what the world expected. He stood beside her, released a statement, called it deeply distressing, presented a united front. The British press followed the script perfectly. Livia the victim, Marco the obsessive villain. It was clean, simple, believable. Exactly the kind of story people want to hear. But the truth was far more dangerous. Because behind the headlines, behind the carefully crafted statements, behind the performance, the story was already unraveling. And what actually happened would change everything. Between 2015 and 2016, Colin and Livia Giugioli slipped into a quiet separation, whispering to close friends that they were re-evaluating their marriage. No headlines, no drama, just silence. But in that silence, something else was growing. Back in Rome, Livia reconnected with Marco Brancaccia, a childhood friend who knew her long before the fame, before the image, before the carefully curated life. What began as innocent nostalgia quickly crossed a line. Conversations turned intimate. Intimacy turned into a full-blown affair. They weren't hiding in the shadows either. In Italy, far from the reach of British tabloids, they were seen together, openly, comfortably, like two people who weren't supposed to be secrets. Then, just as quietly as it began, it ended. By late 2016, Colin and Livia reconciled. The marriage, at least on the surface, was back on. Livia cut Marco off, but Marco didn't disappear. The messages that followed weren't neat or polite. They were messy, emotional, raw. The kind of messages people send when they feel discarded, when they're trying to make sense of being shut out. Threats? That depends on who you believe. Marco said no, Livia said yes, and Colin chose a side. What followed wasn't just a private dispute, it became a legal war. A stalking case moved through the Italian courts, backed fully by Colin, his influence, his resources, his reputation all reinforcing Livia's version of events. For a while, that version held. Until 2019. That's when everything collapsed. Livia suddenly withdrew the charges. No long fight, no drawn-out trial. Just a statement, brief but devastating. She admitted the relationship with Marco had been consensual, admitted she had misrepresented what came after. The affair was real. The stalking wasn't. And Marco had proof. Messages, receipts. Evidence that painted a completely different story. Where Livia had pursued him, where the relationship was mutual, and where his attempts to reach her afterward came from confusion, not menace. The fallout was brutal. Italian media tore into Livia, exposing the false narrative piece by piece. In contrast, British tabloids moved carefully, some even burying the update, as if protecting the image of the man caught in the middle. But image couldn't undo reality. Colin hadn't just been betrayed by the affair. He'd stood publicly beside a story that wasn't true, defending it, funding it, giving it weight. In the end, the humiliation came in two waves. First, the betrayal, then the realization that he had been pulled into a deception that nearly destroyed another man's life. And this time, there was no script to follow. Friends say he was crushed, shattered in a way that went beyond betrayal. This wasn't just Livia stepping away. It was being wielded as a weapon in a story that wasn't his. A story where everything he had trusted about his marriage, about the woman he loved, was now in question. Colin, the actor celebrated for playing men of honor, had become the fool in his own life. And unlike any film, there was no script, no direction, no comeback line. He withdrew into silence, the only refuge when every word risks detonating like a landmine. The world watched, waiting to see if the perfect gentleman would finally crumble, the final collapse. Then, in December 2019, came the joint statement. Colin and Livia were separating. Polished, diplomatic, clinical. They would maintain a loving friendship and co-parent with respect and privacy. Every syllable had been negotiated, a shield against future headlines. What it didn't say, Colin's heart had been ripped out. 22 years of marriage, gone. And yet he carried on. Awards season rolled on, and Colin walked the red carpets alone, smiling for cameras, delivering gracious interviews about his work. To the world, the man was unshakable, elegant as ever. But inside, his life was rubble. That's the cruel paradox of brilliance. The better you are at your performance, the more the world assumes you're untouchable, even when you're falling apart. The divorce hit in 2020, arguably the worst timing anyone could imagine. As the world went into lockdown, Colin found himself isolated in ways no quarantine could explain. His sons were grown, living lives that no longer included him, and the Italian villa that once symbolized their shared dreams had turned into just another line item in a cold, clinical settlement. Dividing a life is somehow worse than heartbreak. It forces you to put a price on what you once thought was priceless. Colin navigated it all with his usual discretion. No interviews, no public drama. Just a quiet redirection of every personal question back to his work. But those who knew him noticed. The man whose charm once flowed effortlessly on set now carried an edge of fatigue. Friends, speaking anonymously to tabloids, revealed he'd begun therapy, not only to process Livia's betrayal, but to confront his own blind spots. How had he missed the warning signs? Had he ignored them because looking would have been too painful? That kind of self-scrutiny doesn't just sting, it cuts deep. Colin had always been the fixer, the man who smoothed edges, kept the peace, made everyone else's chaos bearable. But now, staring at the wreckage of his own life, he wondered if that calm had been courage or cowardice. Had he loved, or had he just been terrified of being alone? There are no neat answers. The divorce settlement was secret, but whispers from legal insiders hinted at a blow far beyond money. It didn't just strip him of assets, it stripped him of identity. Colin Firth, the devoted husband, the passionate father in a sun-drenched Italian love story, had vanished. What remained was a man alone in London, grappling with a self he barely recognized, the role he'd inhabited longest suddenly ripped away. Unlike a movie, heartbreak doesn't come with a tidy resolution. Real divorces drag you through endless contracts, property disputes, and negotiations, each page a reminder that forever isn't real. And with the pandemic locking him inside, there was nowhere to hide. No work, no distractions, no scripts. Just him, his thoughts, and the echoing emptiness of a life once whole. And as if that weren't enough, the ground beneath his career began to crumble. The king had been dethroned. While his personal life collapsed in plain view, his professional world quietly faltered, leaving him stranded between two falling empires, one of love, one of ambition. The roles that used to land effortlessly were slipping through his fingers, claimed by younger actors embodying Hollywood's obsession with fresh faces. In an industry where the window for leading men closes fast, Colin was slowly aging out, trapped in a system chasing the next big sensation. After his Oscar win in 2011, he'd become selective, chasing quality over quantity, a strategy that only works when you're at your peak. But for a divorced man in his 60s, tangled in whispers and scandal, selectivity starts to look a lot like unavailability. The headline-grabbing, career-defining roles, the ones that sweep awards and cement legacies, now went to actors in their 40s, leaving Colin to the supporting parts, mentors, fathers, the steady hand behind the protagonist. These are the roles you accept when you know you're no longer the story's center. The Kingsman franchise became his anchor, a playground of suave spies and hidden secrets, action and charm wrapped in a perfectly tailored suit. They were fun films, profitable, and utterly Oscar-proof, yet Colin needed them, not just for the paycheck, but for purpose. Divorce settlements drain even the richest accounts, especially when estates stretch across continents and grown children depend on you. Still, there was a quiet sting in seeing an Oscar winner slip into another spy suit, while younger stars claimed the glory he once commanded. He never complained. He showed up, did the work, and never suggested the roles were beneath him. That's the British way, after all. Composed, dignified, carrying on even as the spotlight drifts, leaving a once bright career fading into the margins of its own history. The pandemic hit like a wrecking ball, shutting down film sets worldwide and freezing the industry in place. When production slowly crawled back to life, Colin was in his early 60s, facing a younger, sharper generation who had spent lockdown sculpting bodies, launching streaming projects, or mastering viral trends. He had no social media, no podcasts, no TikTok stunts to stay visible. Colin was a master of craft in an age that demanded spectacle, and the gap was brutal. Roles that would have once been guaranteed with his name attached now went elsewhere. Not because he had failed, not because he had slipped professionally, but because Hollywood doesn't worship quiet survivors. It craves drama. A messy meltdown, a public addiction, a scandal-turned redemption arc. That sells tickets. Colin had endured humiliation with dignity, and in Hollywood, dignity doesn't pay. Meanwhile, the bills didn't care about nuance. Post-divorce, post-scandal, Colin still had a lifestyle to maintain, a standard he'd built during years of Oscar-caliber paychecks. Without the blockbuster checks rolling in, he found himself accepting roles he might have refused before. It's a trap familiar to anyone who's lived large at the top. Once the golden tide recedes, you're left scrambling to keep the mansion afloat. Colin wasn't broke, but the 8-figure paydays that once defined him were gone. There's a strange kind of anxiety that lives in that gap between comfortable and rich, a quiet panic you can't shake. Watching younger actors snag the roles, the acclaim, the cultural spotlight he once owned, that grief cuts deeper than loss of money. It's the ache of being someone you were and will never be again. Then came love, or at least the search for it. After the divorce finalized, tabloids zeroed in with predatory precision. Every dinner, every gallery visit, every casual conversation with a woman became fodder for rumors, speculation, and clickbait headlines. A glance, a laugh, a shared coffee, enough to ignite stories of secret romances. The scrutiny was relentless. How do you date when the world is monetizing your loneliness? In 2021, Colin's name surfaced with a handful of women, none of it real. Sources say it wasn't a shortage of interest. People wanted him for his fame, his access, the story they could tell. Not for him. Friends noted a change. Colin had grown guarded, walls thicker than ever, making genuine connection feel nearly impossible. Betrayal leaves a mark you can't see, but you feel it in every glance, every word, every touch. Colin had been burned by someone he trusted completely, and opening up again felt less like love than signing up for pain. He went on dates, made the effort, played the part, but no charm, no joke, no smooth conversation could mask the wall he'd built around his heart. Those who got close called him magnetic, funny, endlessly attentive, but always just out of reach. He could debate films, politics, and travel for hours, yet any hint of real vulnerability swiftly dodged. It wasn't arrogance, it was armor. Once you've been burned this badly, instinct keeps you away from the fire, even when the chill is unbearable. In 2023, tabloids whispered about a romance with a BBC producer he'd met at work. They were seen together enough to make headlines, but Colin stayed silent. If anything romantic had sparked, it burned out quietly, leaving nothing but rumors in its wake. By 2024, friends described him as single, and surprisingly, okay with it. There's a strange calm that follows repeated heartbreak, not despair, just acceptance. Maybe being alone is what life meant for him. For a man whose identity had long been defined by being a partner, a father, that acceptance felt like surrender. Yet surrender can hurt less than clinging to hope. Today, Colin stands in that quiet in-between, a man rebuilding, reshaping, learning how to move forward without losing himself in the process. By 2025, Colin Firth wasn't the man commanding red carpets or eight-figure paydays. The spotlight had dimmed, but he was still working, on his own terms. Independent films, the kind where craft outweighs box office, kept him busy. And he had returned to the theater, the place where he first learned to act, finding in live performance a brutal honesty that no camera could ever capture. Theater strips you bare. There's nowhere to hide, no edits, no second takes. For someone who spent decades shielding himself, standing alone under those lights was both terrifying and necessary. At home, his life was quieter. His sons, Luca and Matteo, were carving out their own worlds, and Colin never exploited them for image or applause. Privacy was non-negotiable. At 65, the real heartbreak wasn't a failed marriage. That happens to everyone. What hurt was the truth it exposed. The love he believed in could crumble, trust could be shattered, and the family he thought unbreakable could fracture in ways he never imagined. At an age when most people settle into comfort, he was beginning again, alone, questioning whether anyone had ever truly known him. Tragedy only stays tragic if the story stops. But Colin's story? It's far from over. It's been rewritten, chapter by chapter, choice by choice, wound by wound. And sometimes a rewrite doesn't just tell the truth, it sets it on fire. More raw, more real, more alive than the story you thought you knew.